Meet Timmy. One day, Timmy went to church with his family. Everyone was super nice, and they sang lots of nice songs about how much God loved them. This made Timmy happy. But then they told a story that went something like this. Once upon a time, all people were united and spoke one language. And they came together and said, "Let's make a name for ourselves and build a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens." So they all worked together to build the tower. But then God came down to see what they were building, and he didn't like that they were unified in language and working together to build the tower. So God stopped the building, confused their language, and scattered the people over the whole earth. After the story, Timmy's new church friends went back to singing about God's greatness. But Timmy was confused. The God portrayed in this story did not seem like the same loving God they were singing about. Well, not to worry, Timmy, this video's for you. We're going to explore how this short, seemingly random story appearing in the 11th chapter of Genesis, wedged between two genealogies, is actually pivotal to the overall Bible narrative. So let's start with the basics. What made God so mad, and why did he respond the way he did? When you first read the story, it appears that the humans were good and embodied qualities found on those lame office break room posters. There was unity in that they all spoke one language. There was ambition in that they wanted to make a name for themselves. There was teamwork in that they all came together to build the tower. There was collaboration and there was hard work in that the structure they created was impressive. But this is not how we are supposed to be reading the story. And in order to see that, let's start by looking at how we got here. At the beginning of Genesis, God creates the world and everything in it, including humans. And God tells the humans, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." God dwelt amongst the humans in the Garden of Eden, and man was meant to work in partnership with God to develop the earth. And when humans lived within God's presence, God gave them the promise of life. But then an act of rebellion by Adam and Eve took place that resulted in the two of them naked and ashamed in the garden. And as sin had now pervaded the world, humans were no longer righteous enough to live within God's presence. Death was now inevitable, and man began to spiral. Cain kills his brother Abel, the sons of God rebel, and soon we're told that violence is everywhere. So God floods the world and restarts with Noah and his family. And God repeats the same mandate to Noah that he did to Adam. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But right after arriving back on dry land, Noah plants a vineyard, makes wine, and gets drunk. And he ends up naked and ashamed in a garden, just like Adam. And we are immediately told of another sin committed by Noah's son Ham. All of this to show that the problem of sin was deeper than what could be wiped away with a flood. And the Tower of Babel falls within this long string of pre- and post-flood rebellion narratives. And in addition to its position amongst other rebellion narratives, in the chapter before the story of Babel, we are told that the founder of the kingdom of Babel was named Nimrod, a name that in Hebrew sounds almost identical to the word rebel. So before getting to the story, we can see that there are clear signs that something nefarious is at play. So let's dive into this story. It starts out by saying that everyone was speaking the same language, which would make sense because Noah and his family would have all spoken the same language, and it's only been a few generations since then. Then, in Genesis 11:4, we're told that the people came together and said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth." From this line, we can see that the purpose of building the city and the tower was to honor themselves rather than God, and to avoid being scattered across the earth, which appears to be in direct opposition to God's mandate to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But there's more here. In the religious beliefs of Mesopotamia at the time, high places were synonymous with the gods. In fact, biblical scholars generally agree that the Tower of Babel would have been a ziggurat, a tiered temple complex built for Mesopotamian gods that essentially served as a staircase to bring the divine to earth to serve humanity. So with this in mind, we can see that this is not a story of a unified group of hardworking people collaborating to build a nice tower. This is humanity, emboldened by a newfound technology, brazenly coming together in direct opposition to their creator, rejecting God's plan to restore Eden through them, and instead opting to serve their own interest by appeasing lesser gods. In this light, the Tower of Babel represents the climax of human rebellion and the outright rejection of God and God's plan for humanity. And while God would have been justified in simply killing off humanity once and for all, he doesn't. Instead, God, in his mercy, works to restore the original Edenic design by saving humanity from the sin they inflicted upon themselves. But he doesn't do it with this group of people who built the tower. He punishes them. We're told he confuses their language and scatters them across the earth. And in Deuteronomy chapters 4 and 32, it's made clear that God is not only scattering them, but in a sense, he's disinheriting them, giving them over to follow lesser gods and their own evil desires. And it is in this state of affairs where the rest of the Bible story kicks off. The Tower of Babel is a hinge point, concluding an opening prelude to the rest of the biblical story, which focuses on God working to reclaim humanity and restore Eden, starting with one nation. You see, right after the Tower of Babel, God calls a man named Abram, later to be renamed Abraham, to a land he has prepared for him, a land that will later be known as Israel. And God tells Abraham he will have many descendants and be the father of a great nation. Abraham's grandson Jacob, who God will rename Israel, will have 12 sons who will represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And God said, "These people will spread amongst the earth, and one day, through this line, all people of the earth would be blessed." And the rest of the Old Testament chronicles God's interaction with the Israelite people. It's Israel versus the other nations, and Yahweh proving his superiority over those nations' inferior gods. And God works to restore the concept of Eden through the Israelite people, establishing a meeting place with them, first in a tabernacle and then in a temple. These structures were significant in that they represented God's presence on earth and God's dwelling place amongst his people. And while it was far from the original Edenic relationship where God and humans lived together unrestricted, since now, due to sin, to even get close to the temple required an extensive list of ritual and sacrifice, it nevertheless represented the first steps of reunification between the heavenly and earthly realms. And as God's chosen people, Israel was meant to live set apart from the rest of the world, embodying a superior ethic and allegiance to the one true God. And God tells them, when they follow his commands, he will bless them. But we routinely see Israel fail to live up to their end of the bargain, at times even worshiping other nations' gods. Because of this, we see a cycle where Israel disobeys, they are oppressed, they cry out, God delivers them, and they disobey once more. And they do this despite God sending prophets, reminding them of what happened before and warning them of things to come if they don't change their ways. Like, for instance, in Deuteronomy 28:36, when Moses very clearly warned them that they will end up in exile. Well, what do you know? Despite the warnings, things get so bad in Israel that God removes his protection, and Jerusalem is invaded by a mighty empire. And this empire destroys the city of Jerusalem, including the temple signifying God's presence amongst his people. Then they take God's people captive and make them exiles in their land. The empire that did this was none other than Babylon. The empire that did this was Babylon. Actually, the Hebrew term for Babylon and Babel is the same, and in some spots it depends on the version of the Bible you're reading as to whether it's translated as Babel or Babylon. Either way, Babel or Babylon is an empire stemming from the sinful spirit that led to the construction of the tower. So if you had any doubt about the case made at the beginning of this video against those constructing the tower, this should make it abundantly clear. The moment God removes his protection, the empire springing forth from Babel comes in and destroys the temple, symbolic of God's presence on earth, and then takes his people as captives, showing that they are and have always been in direct opposition to God's plan. Now, in this continuous cycle of rebellion followed by God's faithfulness, God again responds to his people's pleas, and the Babylonians are defeated by the Persians, and the Israelite people are allowed to return to their land. But while the empire of Babylon was defeated, it's not the last time the Bible would reference it. Babylon would become a symbol of the kingdom or kingdoms of earth, in that if God's is the kingdom of heaven, Babylon's is the kingdom of earth. Babylon becomes a term used metaphorically to represent all kingdoms, nations, and their inhabitants that are in opposition to God and all things holy. A little more on that to come, but for now, let's get back to the Israelites' return to Jerusalem. With this return came great optimism that this return would bring true the promises of God and his prophets. Promises like the one he made to Abraham that through his line, all people of the earth would be blessed. Promises about a coming Messiah from the line of David. Promises that God would reunite his people and his temple would be restored, and there would be a new and greater Jerusalem. And they had hope in a new covenant that God declared. One he said was not like the one their ancestors broke, but a new one in which he would write the law on their hearts and remember their sins no more. So they rebuilt the city, its walls, and the temple. But it was very clear that this was not the new Jerusalem that had been prophesied. The city was a remnant of its former self. The second temple didn't compare to the glory of the first, and there was infighting and idolatry among the people. And the Old Testament ends with a still rebellious people continuing their cycles of rebellion, except worse. Prophecy would come to a close, and history tells us that the rebuilt temple would be destroyed a bit over 500 years later by the Romans in 72 AD, and still to this day, the temple would not be rebuilt. A very bleak ending. That is, if it were the end. But sometime around 6 to 4 BC, some things started to happen that were prophesied in the Old Testament about a coming Messiah. A virgin became pregnant and gave birth to a child in Bethlehem. And that child would grow into a man who started a ministry beginning in Galilee, where he would teach with profound authority, often in parables, and he would give sight to the blind and cause the lame to walk. But he also fulfilled other things said by the prophets. While he amassed many followers, he was ultimately despised and rejected by mankind. And though he was sinless, they pierced him for the sins of others, and he was cut off from the land of the living. But he gave his life as an offering for sin and to make intercession for sinners. And having undergone this suffering, he was raised back to life. As prophesied, Jesus, God in the flesh, lived a sinless life, and though undeserving of death, was killed for the sins of many. And while he could have stopped this, he willingly underwent the punishment to serve as the perfect sacrifice, a sacrifice that would remove the need for all other sacrifices, as it would for once and always atone for the sins of humanity. In being undeserving of the curse of sin, which is death, Jesus rose from the grave and continued to minister to his disciples for 40 days before ascending to heaven. And some 10 days later was a Jewish festival known as Shavuot, or better known by its Greek name, Pentecost. Shavuot was one of 3 Jewish pilgrimage festivals, a day when Jews from all over the world would return to Jerusalem to offer the first fruits of the harvest at the temple. And it's at this time an event happened that would change the world forever. The followers of Jesus were chilling in Jerusalem when suddenly a loud sound of rushing wind filled the room and something described as divided tongues of fire rested upon them, and they began to speak in what is referred to as tongues. And Jews visiting from all around the world were onlooking and stunned, because despite their diversity in language, each heard the followers of Jesus speaking in their own native tongue. These miraculous signs mark the arrival of the Holy Spirit. As Peter explained, having been exalted to the right hand of God, Jesus had received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit, and had poured out what was being seen and heard. We're told that 3,000 people were baptized in the name of Jesus that day, and those new believers would then go back to all the nations of the earth to spread the gospel. And the rest of the Bible story covers Jesus' disciples going off to distant lands to make disciples. So do you see what's happening? It's the undoing of Babel and God's reclaiming of the nations. You see, at the Tower of Babel, people in opposition to God gathered to build a temple for foreign gods, and God confused their language and scattered them over the earth, giving them over to follow false gods. At Pentecost, you see people from all nations coming together in Jerusalem to make sacrifice to the one true God, and you see God unifying their language and imparting his spirit within them, writing the law in their hearts and making them living temples. What do I mean by living temples? Well, in Eden, God dwelt with man, but due to sin, man could no longer be in God's presence. The tabernacle and the temple were the Israelites' meeting places with God, but to even get within their proximity required strict adherence to many laws and an elaborate system of sacrifice. But once the perfect sacrifice was made, dealing with sin forevermore, this removed the barrier of sin and allowed for God's Spirit to indwell in those believers who invite him in, making them living temples of the living God. What's amazing about this is that post-Pentecost, we get to be in relationship with God in a way that no one before Pentecost ever could be. And for those who have accepted forgiveness and possess the Spirit, they too, like Jesus, will not be held by death. When God said all people of the earth would be blessed through Abraham's lineage, it's this ability to accept the offer of forgiveness and unification that was being referred to. No longer are God's people one ethnicity congregated in one place, but God is reclaiming all people, building his nation and establishing his presence irrespective of national, racial, or political boundaries. And it's undisputed that Christianity has become the largest and most diverse people movement of all time. And we're told that one day, all nations of the earth will be reclaimed. In Revelation, the final book of the New Testament, Babylon, represented by a woman drunk on the blood of saints and martyrs, is now destroyed once and for all. And a new city, the promised New Jerusalem, is brought down from heaven. And we're told there's no temple in the city because God's presence dwells amongst all creation, fulfilling the original Edenic design. And while that's amazing news, we're going to end on some not so great news. Right now, we live in the midst of a transition period. Unfortunately, you live in exile. You live in Babylon, the kingdom of the earth. And Babylon is a powerful empire, and this world you live in is full of discontentment, suffering, and distraction. It is a nation that rewards and encourages things that are not of God. But like those called before you, you are meant to live set apart from this world and be a light in the darkness. You, as a living temple, are now a symbolic meeting place where people can meet God, and you've been commissioned to spread that light in you to others to bring about the restoration of God's world. So Timmy, I hope this helped to clear up the Tower of Babel and how this story of human rebellion plays into the larger story of God working to rescue and restore humanity. If you'd like to learn more, please subscribe to our channel and consider supporting the creation of more videos like this by making a donation at prodigal.org.